Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about chemical bonds. These are essentially energy relationships between electrons and other reacting atoms. Chemical bonds aren't actual physical structures, they're basically just an attraction between two or more atoms. Now, these all relate to electrons because these electrons are the subatomic particles that are involved in chemical reactions, and they determine whether or not a chemical reaction will occur. And it turns out chemical bonds, when they form or break, those are chemical reactions. So we could talk about bonds chemically as being related to electrons. Now, electrons occupy areas around the nucleus. We call it the electron shell. If you all remember from a previous slide, or previous video rather, we saw how the electron shells around an atom are sort of orbital, right? So they can form a sort of spherical unit or other shapes around that nucleus. Now, each shell contains electrons that have certain amount of both kinetic and potential energy. So they're moving and they have some potential energy as well. So these shells are also referred to energy levels. So depending on where these electrons are located, they might have a certain degree of kinetic energy or a certain degree of potential energy. Now, depending on the size of the atom, they can actually have up to 7 different electron shells. And each shell can only hold a specific number of electrons. So think about these as almost being layers around the nucleus, where each layer of electron shell can hold only certain numbers of electrons, and these other layers can hold more or less. And at its maximum, you can have 7 layers of electron shells around a nucleus. Now, these shells can only hold a specific number of electrons. So the shell that's closest to the nucleus is filled first, and this shell can only hold 2 electrons. The second shell can hold 8, and the third shell can hold 18, and so on. Now, the outermost electron shell is what we call the valence shell. And I'm not saying that all atoms have a 7th electron valence shell, because some atoms only have 1 electron shell, and that would be their valence shell. Or other atoms have 2 electron shells, and the outermost of those 2 would be the valence shell. Now, these electrons in the valence shell have the most potential energy because they're farthest from the nucleus. Now, these electrons that are involved in chemical reactions are the ones that are located in the valence shell. So if we understand the chemical properties of an atom in terms of the number of electrons in its valence shell, as well as other factors like the size of the nucleus and the charge in the nucleus, we can make some predictions about what types of bonds may occur. Now, there's this thing called the octet rule, and this is a rule of 8s. And atoms desire 8 electrons in their valence shell. So what we find is that for most atoms, we need 8 electrons in the valence shell for those atoms to be happy, so to speak. There are some exceptions to this rule, though. Smaller atoms like hydrogen and helium, they only prefer 2 electrons in their shell. Now, most, though, desire 8 electrons, and this is the driving force behind a lot of chemical reactions. So if an atom already has its full 8 electrons, then these aren't going to be very chemically reactive. They don't need to take other electrons. They're happy. They've got their all 8 electrons in their valence shell, so they don't need to try to steal electrons from another atom. So most atoms, though, don't have full valence shells, and it's this property in itself that allows atoms to interact with each other, because some might steal electrons from other atoms, or vice versa. So atoms can gain or lose or share electrons as well, and when they share electrons, this forms bonds. Like covalent bonds is a form of sharing electrons, and this allows them to both achieve stability of 8 electrons in their valence shells. So an example of this we're seeing here is helium. This is its electron shell, but its valence shell here only has 2 electrons in it. Other example here is neon. You can see that here's the first electron shell, here's the second, and this one would be the valence shell. But you see it has 8 electrons in its shell, so that it's happy. Neon is a pretty unreactive type of atom. This is one of the noble gases. Now, other chemically reactive elements include things like hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and sodium, because if you look at their valence shells, they don't have the octet, right? You see that oxygen has 6 electrons in its valence shell here, whereas sodium here only has 1, and carbon has 4. So knowing that these ones aren't satisfied because they haven't filled their electron shells, their valence shell rather, we can understand that these are actually pretty chemically reactive elements. In fact, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are some of the most abundant elements in the human body. So our molecules are pretty reactive, and sodium is also an important element within our bodies. Now there are three types of chemical bonds. We have ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. And in the next part of this video, what we'll do is move through and talk about the structure of each of these types of bonds and how they occur. So the first is the ionic bond, and these are where ions basically either gain or lose an electron. And once those atoms have a charge, that's when we call them an ion. So the number of protons does not equal the number of electrons, so that because we have this imbalance in the positively and negatively charged particles of an atom, that gives these ions a charge. So if you have more protons than electrons, then the ion will have a positive charge because protons carry a positive charge. And if you have more electrons than protons, then you'll have a negative charge because electrons have a negative charge. So ionic bonds involve the transfer of valence shell electrons. And so this is an interesting phenomenon where one atom may steal the electron from another atom. And for that atom that's still an electron, it's gaining a negative charge, right? Once it gains that negative charge, we call that an anion, and because it now has an extra electron. And for the atom that lost an electron, it lost a negative charge. Now it has more protons than electrons, so we would call that a cation, which means it has a positive charge. And what's interesting then is that there's actually an electric attraction to the anion and cation ions that were formed, so that the negatively charged ion is then attracted to the positively charged ion, and they form a type of bond here called an ionic bond. And it's really just an attraction of oppositely charged ions, so anions and cations. Think of this as almost like a magnetic attraction of positive and negative ends. So what we see here is an example of an ionic bond forming where sodium could lose an electron to chlorine. So chlorine is more electronegative, which means that it's more likely to steal electrons from other atoms just due to the properties of its nucleus and other factors. Now, because it stole an electron from sodium, this means that chlorine gained an extra electron, and you see that now its octet rule is satisfied. And guess what? Now it has a negative charge because it has an extra electron in relationship to its protons. So now we call this an anion. Now, because sodium hasn't had an electron stolen, it lost a negative charge, and now because it has more protons than electrons, it gained a positive charge here, a net positive charge on this atom. And what's fascinating is that these positive and negative charges then attract to each other, so that they form this sort of magnetic attraction between the negative and positive atoms that are now formed. We call that an ionic bond. Now, most ionic compounds are actually salts. So when they're dry, these salts form crystals. An example is sodium chloride, and sodium chloride is basically table salt, and it forms a sort of crystalline lattice structure where you see a lot of negatively charged chlorine atoms and positively charged sodium atoms, and they all kind of aggregate together almost like a bucket of magnets that all just sort of stick together. Now the ionic bond is not a very strong type of bond, and actually this can be broken in a variety of circumstances. In fact, you can even just break this with your bare hands, right? Because you can take a salt crystal and just break that apart. So these are really not that strong of a bond, but they play an important role in our biology. Now, covalent bonds are formed by the sharing of two or more electrons. And this differs from the ionic bond because that was where you stole electrons from another atom. Covalent bonds are more of a sharing. So if two electrons are shared between atoms, this results in a single covalent bond. If 4 electrons are shared, it forms a double bond. And if 6 electrons are shared, we form a triple bond. And you can see that this would be an increasing degree of strength, right? How a single bond wouldn't be as strong as a triple bond because these atoms are sharing more electrons, and so they're more attracted to each other in that regard. Now, these covalent bonds are more stable because they allow each atom to fill its valence shell. And there's 2 major types of covalent bonds. We got the polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. So what we find here, an example of when a covalent bond could form. So you can see we have carbon, and in its valence shell, it only has 4 electrons here. Now remember, because of the octet rule, we want to have this carbon atom fill its valence shell with 8 electrons. So what's fascinating here then is that this carbon atom then can form bonds with 4 other atoms in order to satisfy or fill its octet rule. So we can see here then is we can form from carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms, they can all bond together to form methane. Methane gas is CH4, and this is an example of a covalent bond, because what happened is, okay, so hydrogen has shared an electron with carbon to form one covalent bond, and you can think about carbon as almost gaining an electron because they're sort of sharing it in this regard. And if you see here, now carbon's satisfied because now it's satisfied its octet rule, right? 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons now in carbon's valence shell. And also hydrogen is satisfied too because it's actually satisfied its rule. Remember, hydrogen doesn't follow the octet, but it does prefer 2 electrons in its valence shell. So you can see that it was able to satisfy this by forming a bond with carbon. And this is just an example of a covalent bond. So another example here would be where 2 oxygen atoms can interact to form molecular oxygen, or O2. And you can see that oxygen here only has 6 electrons in its valence shell, same with this one. And so what it can do then is form a double bond with another oxygen atom, and so that each oxygen atom now has satisfied its octet rule because you have 2, 3, 5, 6, and then 8 here. There's another 2. So that each oxygen atom have actually satisfied the octet rule. And this actually forms a double covalent bond. Now the double covalent bond is more strong than a single covalent bond, so molecular oxygen is actually a pretty strong molecule here. Now another example here is between 2 nitrogen atoms. We can see that nitrogen only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 electrons in its valence shell, but it can get another 3 from another nitrogen atom, so that each nitrogen atom here can satisfy its octet rule by forming a triple bond with each other. And so that this has now 8 electrons in its valence shell. This one has 8 electrons in its valence shell because they're sharing 3 extra electrons each, so that each one gets those 3 that it wants. And so that we see here's a triple bonded nitrogen. So this forms molecular nitrogen, which is nitrogen gas. This is actually the most common gas in our atmosphere on Earth. Now, covalent bonds can be either nonpolar or polar. If they're nonpolar, we're saying that there's equal sharing of electrons, but it results in an electrically balanced molecule, which we say is nonpolar because there aren't like opposite poles of electrons here. So carbon dioxide is a classic example of a nonpolar molecule. So we find here then is we have oxygen, carbon, oxygen, and because it has sort of this linear arrangement here, there's a pretty equal distribution of electrons around this molecule, and because there aren't like more electrons at one end than another, this means that it's pretty electrically balanced, and so that there aren't separations of charges, so that therefore it's nonpolar in the sense that it has no poles. Now, polar covalent bonds is where you have an unequal sharing of electrons. And this is kind of an odd thing that happens because some atoms can kind of hog electrons more often than other atoms. And this has to do with the properties of the nucleus. And because some atoms have more electron attracting abilities than others. And this actually results in ends of a molecule where one end is more negative than another. So we say that the end that's more attracted to electrons is electronegative, and the other end that's less attracted to those electrons is electropositive because now it's relatively losing some electrons. So water is an example of a polar molecule. You know, oxygen is a very electronegative type of atom. It actually exerts a greater pull on electrons than hydrogen. And so what this ends up with is a dipole. And a dipole is essentially where we have charges at opposite ends. So we see here we have oxygen, hydrogen, hydrogen, or you can see it over here, or H2O. And because oxygen is electronegative, it actually has a tendency to pull electrons more often to this end than over here because hydrogen can't really hold on to its electrons as well. And this ultimately results in an unequal distribution of sharing of electrons, where one end has more negative charge than another. It's a partially negative charge because it's just that oxygen is actually kind of hogging more electrons in this end than over here. So we say that this end of water we say is electron deshielded, where some of the electrons are being pulled this way by oxygen, and that yields a kind of positive side over here, partial positive ends. And because we have a negative and positive end here, this is a dipole. And it's still a covalent bond because there's still sharing of electrons. It's just an unequal sharing. And that unequal sharing yields this dipole, and that therefore makes this a polar covalent type of bond. And this is important to learn because when we talk about how molecules are transported across the cell, it's important to refer to their polarity, whether they're nonpolar or polar types of molecules. So if they're polar, they're more negative at one end than another. Now, this is showing just an example or summary of those types of bonds here. So we have nonpolar covalent bonds, polar covalent, and ionic bonds. Ionic bonds, we have a complete transfer of electrons. If you remember, one atom stole electrons from another, and that yielded a negative charge on one atom and a positive charge on another. And these separate charged particles are actually then attracted to each other, and that in itself is an ionic bond. But this is actually weaker. This is a weaker type of bond than even a polar covalent bond. So polar covalent bonds have an unequal sharing of electrons, and that yields a slightly negative end at one side of the molecule and a slightly positive end at another. And that actually is an example of polar molecules. So this is a polar covalent bond. And then the nonpolar covalent bond is where you have an absolute equal sharing of electrons. The charges are balanced because they're equally shared between these particular atoms, and therefore you don't have like electrons at one end more than another. And so because there's an equal distribution of electrons around this molecule, you don't get this separation of charge, and so that it's nonpolar. There's no poles here. It's just sort of electrically neutral all around. Now, hydrogen bonds are another type of bond that's interesting. It's actually an attractive force between electropositive and electronegative atoms on another molecule. But the reason why it's called a hydrogen bond is that you need hydrogen to form this type of bond. Now, it's not a true bond. It's actually more of a weak magnetic type of attraction. And this occurs between polar molecules. So a common type of hydrogen bond is actually between the dipoles of water. So it actually also makes water a liquid. And if we look at, between two different types of water molecules, they form this intramolecular type of bond. Intra meaning between, molecular meaning molecule. So an intramolecular bond is actually between two different molecules. And what we find here then is an example of these hydrogen bonds. So remember, water is a dipole, where we have a polar molecule, we have a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on another. And what's interesting is that if you put a bunch of dipole molecules together, those charges can start to line up. Where you have the positive charge on one end of another molecule attracted to the negative charge of another molecule. And this actually forms the hydrogen bond. Now, the only types of molecules that can participate in hydrogen bonds are those polar covalent types of bonds, but you need hydrogen, and this has to interact with another type of atom, which can either be oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine. But this is just showing the example of water. Now, this is an example of a hydrogen bond, which plays a lot of important roles in our own biology. And you guys have all seen hydrogen bonds before because this is one of those factors that helps to explain surface tension. So surface tension is when the water molecules on the surface of water all line up at their poles, where the positive end of one water molecule will line up with the negative end of another. It actually creates a little bit of stickiness or tension on the surface of water, and some animals can actually utilize this to their survival strategies. Like this water strider can utilize the surface tension of water to run on the surface of water.